Hey there guys, so today we're going to be doing a comparison of a bunch of different mini PCs that are at the $200 to $300 price point. I think that this is the price category that has the most amount of competition in the entire mini PC market. See, if you look at the $100 to $200 price range, you're really mostly going to be looking at different versions of Intel's Alder Lake N-based chips and the refreshed Twin Lake chips. So think things like the N95, N100, N150. All of these are effectively the same chips, so you're not really getting much of a difference at all in this price category. The only other competition with it is older Ryzen-based APUs like the Ryzen 5 3550H, the 3500U, or if you go down the bare bones route, you could find some systems that have the Ryzen 3 5300U. And of course, if you go from the $300 to $400 price range, that's really mostly dominated by either 6000 series from AMD or very cheap Zen 4 based APUs. But in this price category, we're really looking at quite a wide gap of options. So let's run through some of the systems that we have here. Now keep in mind that these systems themselves are here to just represent the chips. They're not necessarily meant to represent specific systems that are available. In fact, some of these configurations, specifically these two right here, are not even made anymore. But running through what we have here, we have right here the TrigKey S5, which is currently still available, though it has a slight revision done to it. But it rocks the Ryzen 5 5500U, which is still available to this day. Now, this is a Zen 2 based 6-core 12-thread processor with 7 Vega cores, and it has 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD, which is pretty much standard across the board here. At the price points that we're looking at here, all of these systems are going to have 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. You might be able to find some systems that are configured with these specific chips that have 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD, but chances are you are going to be at that $300 price limit or past that. So 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabyte SSDs are just pretty standard across the board here. Now, the next system is the Sur 5 with the Ryzen 7 5700U. As I said before, this is not a configuration that is available anymore, but there are a ton of systems that are still being sold with the Ryzen 7 5700U. So that is an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 based APU. And of course, the standard 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabyte SSD. Next to that is the upgraded version of this, where now we have the Ryzen 5 5600H, and this is a Zen 3 based APU with 6 cores, 12 threads, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a 512 gigabyte SSD. In terms of the iGPUs, technically Vega based, this has the highest end one because it has the full 8 cores, while this has 7 and this has 7. But as you'll end up seeing in the testing, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is immediately going to be the best performer, at least of the Vega based systems. Now, next we do have the Firebat M56 that has the Ryzen 5 6600H. That is a 6-core, 12-thread Zen 3 Plus based APU. And really the big change between this and these older systems here is the fact that it does have RDNA 2 graphics. So these right here, I consider them to be the legacy category because of the fact that they are using Vega graphics, while this and this are using RDNA 2. Now, while RDNA 2 isn't the latest and greatest, it is still a massive leap in terms of performance, and you're going to be seeing that in the comparisons. Now, in terms of the CPU, the Ryzen 6 6600H is essentially the same thing as the 5600H. There was really very minor improvements in terms of the architecture. It was really more of a refinement. So CPU-wise, you are going to see that these two right here are going to be very comparable to each other. But again, 16 gigabytes of RAM, 512 gigabyte SSD. And then lastly, we have the one that I was really the most interested in doing this comparison about, and that is the Firebat A6. Recently took a look at this system, just a recent pickup that has blown my mind in terms of the price point that it's at. It has a Ryzen 7 6800H, a chip that you will not find in this price category from any other manufacturer as far as I've been able to find. And I really wanted to know just why exactly it's being sold at such a cheap price, because right now on AliExpress, this thing is $230. It is such a ridiculously cheap system that as of right now, when I looked on Amazon and AliExpress, it is essentially within the same price of all of these different systems. In fact, all of these chips in general are within $10 to $20 of each other at most, but there are some pretty wide performance gaps. Now, part of the reason that this this thing is so cheap, I suspect is because of the single channel memory. See, it has 16 gigabytes of RAM, but it's only one stick, and that's really going to hamper performance. And that is something that I want to talk about before we jump into these comparisons. When you're looking at any of these systems that are being sold, you have to pay attention to the RAM configuration. See, another system that I had considered for this price comparison is this right here. This is the Paladin W04, also available under the name the Triku W04. Triku and Paladin are the exact same company. They are owned by the exact same parent company, so they use the exact same chassis and exact same configurations within both brands. And this is one of my favorite systems with this type of chip. This specifically has the Ryzen 5 5500U, but the issue is that you open it up, immediately you see single channel memory. So this is going to hamper performance, at least iGPU wise, in comparison to something like the S5 here that has dual channel memory. So if you are shopping for any of these systems, you do have to pay attention to this. Now, having the one stick of 16 gigabytes of RAM can be nice if you are planning on upgrading this, because you just need to buy a second 3200 megatransfers DDR4 memory stick and you're good to go. And the benefit of that is that when you upgrade to 32 gigabytes of RAM, you don't necessarily have to buy a kit that comes with two sticks that you then end up removing the old sticks and you just have them laying around, or you're trying to sell them on Facebook Marketplace. So there is some benefit to this, but only if you're looking to upgrade it yourself at some point or immediately. So that is something to keep in mind. I am going to be testing the Firebat in both its stock configuration with just a single stick, and we are going to upgrade it because even if we upgrade it at the $230 price point that it's at right now, that means that upgrading it to 32 gigabytes of RAM is still going to keep us at the below $300 price point. So let's jump into the comparison. Now, jumping over to Cinebench R23, you can see that there is a pretty massive difference between the top end and the bottom end of the systems, where the Ryzen 5 5500U ends up scoring almost half the performance of the Ryzen 7 6800H in multi-core performance, while the Ryzen 7 5700U, the Ryzen 5 5600H, and the Ryzen 5 6600H all end up scoring pretty close to each other. The 5600H does end up falling behind a little bit in comparison to the 6600H because of the fact that it does have a lower TDP while configured here, where it caps out at 35 watts, while the 6600H is able to go up to 45 watts. But as you can see, that's not really leading to a massive increase in performance, and both the single and multi-core performance scores are relatively close to each other. But it's clear that the Zen 2 based systems are falling behind. It's not a substantial difference, so if you really just needed a absolute cheapest possible everyday computer, something with the Ryzen 5 5500U wouldn't be a bad choice, but it all really comes down to price. If an extra $20 pretty much gives you a leap like what we're seeing here with the Ryzen 7 6800H, why would you not do it? It really is the standout here, where not only does it dominate in terms of single core performance, the multi-core performance is just at a whole different level. So starting off the comparisons, we are going to be taking a look at the legacy systems, or the ones that are based off of Vega, and we're pretty much going to see which is the best performer here, and then we're going to compare it to the RDNA systems. That way we don't jumble up everything on the screen. But as you can see here, all of these different systems are running Counter-Strike 2 with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though FSR is disabled on all of them, and you can see that there is some pretty noticeable performance differences here, at least between the Ryzen 5 5500U and its bigger brother siblings, where the 5700U is able to have a pretty commanding lead over the 5500U, but the 5600H surprisingly manages to take the lead here by a very small margin in terms of the FPS average, though the 1% lows are effectively identical. So really this is a margin of error difference, but what that really shows is that the 5500U is kind of holding back the Radeon 7 that it has, because the same exact iGPU put with the 5600H ends up closing the gap to the point where that extra core difference with the 5700U, at least on the iGPU side of things, does not really matter at all in this specific title. All of them though give a pretty playable experience, though the 5500U is really at the edge of playability more than anything else, but all of them do score an above 60 FPS average, which is impressive to see. In the next title that I took a look at, we're taking a look at Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord running with the low graphics settings, not the lowest graphics settings, but just the low preset. And you can see here that we get kind of a repeat scenario, though the gap between the 5500U and the other systems is not as wide. It pretty much has the same 1% lows as the 5700U, though the 5700U does end up beating it out slightly in terms of FPS average, but the 5600H does end up taking the lead here, where it not only has the best FPS average, but it also has a lead in terms of the 1% lows. So again, that jump between Zen 2 to Zen 3 really does seem to have a difference in terms of gaming performance, mostly because of the fact that the iGPU is really able to stretch its legs here. Now, the next game that we took a look at is Rainbow Six Siege running with the high preset, which isn't really high. It's more like the medium graphics setting, since it is at the absolute middle of the different graphics presets, but we are using that, no upscaling whatsoever, so no FSR, and we are at 100% resolution scale. And as you can see, again, the 5500U is falling behind its other siblings, and even the 5700U is falling behind the 5600H, where it ends up producing the best FPS average and the best 1% lows. Though it should be noted that none of these systems are getting an above 60 FPS average, and for a title like this, that does mean that you're going to have to use FSR at least the ultra quality or quality setting to get that bump. Next up, I took a look at Tiny Tina's Wonderland running with the low graphics preset and no FSR upscaling whatsoever. And one thing that I noticed about this title is that on pretty much every system that I took a look at it tends to have a pop-in problem with the textures, at least in the beginning. And the only one that never really showed that was the 5700U. So that was an interesting result for sure. But what we did end up seeing is that both the 5500U and 5700U ended up giving the exact same 1% lows, so the slight increase in FPS average on the 5700U really was kind of meaningless. And again, the 5600H ends up taking the lead, not just in the FPS average, which is not a very commanding lead by any means. We're looking at just a 4 FPS difference between the worst and best performing of these systems, but the big uplift is in the 1% lows, where now it goes from the low 20s to the upper 20s and puts it far closer to our FPS average, which means that you get a more consistent experience, making it a far more playable experience, because if you just lock the FPS to 30, you can get away with playing on the 5600H at a far more smooth and consistent rate. And the next title that I took a look at is Returnal, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though we aren't using any FSR whatsoever, and of course all of the ray tracing features are disabled. And this one is just such a demanding title that all of these systems effectively ended up performing exactly the same, which is to say they were all an absolute disaster. Our 1% lows were in the single digits across all of them, and the FPS average was pretty much in the low teens for all of these systems. Not a great result, but also not surprising. This is a very demanding workload, and it does seem that the older Vega graphics just are not able to keep up on a title like this, which is again not very surprising. Even modern iGPUs aren't able to do too well on this specific title. And next I took a look at is Black Myth Wukong, running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR, and that is FSR with a 65% render scale. And while the results here are pretty disastrous across the board, where none of these systems are going to get a playable experience, though the 5500U does end up falling behind in both the FPS average and the 1% lows. Meanwhile, the 5700U and the 5600H are both practically identical in performance and are both going to just be a very unplayable experience for such a heavy title like this. Again, Vega-based iGPUs just are not able to keep up with modern titles like this, even with a very aggressive use of FSR, but that's to be expected. There really is just not much you can do, especially because this is a very demanding title for pretty much any systems out there to have to run. And the last game that I took a look at in this comparison is, of course, Company of Heroes 3, running the built-in benchmark. This is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings. Physics are set to medium, and no upscaling whatsoever was used. And across the board on all of these systems, the results aren't spectacular. The 5500U in particular is falling behind, since the FPS average is just in the mid-20s with 1% lows that drop into the teens. And while the 5700U does bump up the FPS average to 31, that is immediately undone by the fact that the 1% lows go all the way down to 16. So it's not going to be a great experience, and you can tell by the frame time chart. charts. Meanwhile, the 5600H is not exactly a great experience either. An FPS average of 30 isn't exactly spectacular, but the 1% lows are at least in the lower mid-20s. And that does mean that it is going to be more playable, though it's nowhere near ideal, and you're definitely going to want to use something like FSR in a title like this. So clearly the 5600H was the winner of those, but where does it compare against its higher end competition? Well, it starts to fall behind the 6600H, and even though they're on the exact same CPU architecture, clearly that jump from RDNA 2 makes a pretty massive difference. But interestingly enough, the single channel version of the 6800H does end up falling behind the 5600H. Though not by a significant margin, there is still a 3 FPS difference in terms of the FPS average and a 1 FPS difference in 1% lows. So 1% lows are kind of margin of error, but that is still a lead happening in the FPS average. And that's a very interesting result there, considering the fact that not only is the 6800H on paper a more powerful CPU and GPU, we are using more power to run that. So it is using more power to get effectively worse performance. But of course, that is the single channel limitation there. And if we were to eliminate that, things would change. But as of right now, in their stock configurations, the 5600H does end up taking a lead here, though the 6600H is the better overall performer here. And of course, taking a look at Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord running with, again, the low in-game graphics settings, you can see that we continue a very similar trend. Though this one shows a significantly smaller difference, where the FPS average between the 6600H and the 5600H is practically non-existent, with identical 1% lows and only a few FPS difference in terms of the average. The 6800H ends up scoring pretty much identically to both of these systems, so all of them are comparable to each other, at least in Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord. That was honestly a pretty surprising result to me, but it does give a very consistent and smooth experience across all of these, which is at least nice to see. Of course, when we jump into Rainbow Six Siege, again running with the high graphics settings and no FSR upscaling whatsoever, you can see that the 6600H ends up taking another lead here, where we finally get an above 60 FPS average with 1% lows in the low mid 40s, which is a great result overall, considering that it is 100% render scale. But the 6800H ends up falling behind the 5600H in terms of gaming performance by just a couple of FPS, but that is a couple of FPS in a scenario that is below 60, so it is pretty meaningful. And this does start to paint a picture as to why exactly the Firebat system is being sold for so cheap. Tiny Tina's Wonderland in particular ends up showing the limitations of the single channel memory with the 6800H, where the FPS average is more comparable to the 5600H, but the 1% lows end up just cratering here. And that overall leads to essentially a 30 FPS average gaming experience that is not going to be smooth or consistent. While the 6600H does end up taking a lead here, it's not a substantial one. It's not going to just suddenly end up being a drastically better experience, because the 1% lows are very close to the 5600H. Still, the 6600H is the overall winner here, and one of the worst showings that we've seen so far of the 6800H. And the absolute thrashing continues if we take a look at Returnal, where being one of the heaviest benchmarks here, it really suffers dramatically by that single channel memory, where the 6600H does end up beating everyone else out here, where we get an FPS average of 19 and a 1% low of 12, so double digit 1% lows finally. Meanwhile, the 6800H ends up performing really more in line with what we were seeing with the 5700U, so a very disappointing result here. But none of these systems are going to come out playable in this title unless you start to use FSR extremely heavily, and we don't have FSR enabled here. And Black Myth Wukong is more of the same, where the 6800H ends up performing pretty much the same as the 5600H, and the 6600H ends up taking a lead here, though not all that meaningful of a lead, in the sense that the playability of the game is still not there. This is of course a very demanding title, but it does show that the 6600H is the best performer in this price category if all you care about is the gaming and you don't plan plan on upgrading your system at all. Company of Heroes 3 ended up being kind of surprising in the sense that the 6800H actually ended up performing effectively the same as the 6600H, where it had a 2 FPS lead in the FPS average, but the 1% lows were lower by 1 FPS. And that is a pretty commanding lead over the 5600H that ends up falling behind both of these chips by a significant margin. Though if you pay attention to the 6800H system, you'll see that the frame times aren't exactly looking as smooth as the 6600H, and that of course comes down to that single channel memory, but we are still getting a far more playable experience out of the 6800H versus the 5600H. So a very interesting result overall, but of course this is all with single channel memory. As I mentioned before, you can upgrade to dual channel on the Firebat system here, and that still leaves you at a below $300 price point. And that upgrade ends up coming with some pretty massive gains. As you can see here in Counter-Strike 2, we go from a level of performance that was very comparable to the 5600H and the 5700U to now taking a very commanding lead over even the 6600H, where now the 1% lows see a massive jump going above 60 by a significant margin, and our FPS average is all the way up to 127. So the results here are insane. Those are some crazy gains to be had. An almost doubling of our 1% lows, and our FPS average still sees a significant increase just from a memory upgrade, and that does still keep us below that $300 threshold. And the same carries over into Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, where before the 6800H was falling behind the 6600H, it now ends up taking a commanding lead, where our FPS average finally hits the triple digits and our 1% lows are more than comfortably above 60. This really is being able to take full advantage of the level of performance that the 6800H has to offer here. And again, going up to 32 gigabytes of RAM is not the thing that's increasing performance, it's the dual channel memory. That is very important for APUs, and while DDR5 being a faster form of memory than DDR4 does end up not suffering as much in terms of the 1% lows, where before it would end up causing some insane levels of inconsistency, as it is right now like this, having that single channel memory still ends up producing a significant impact in your overall gaming performance. Thankfully though, it is a very easy upgrade to do. And you'll see this trend continue again in Rainbow Six Siege, where at the high graphics settings and full render scale, it's able to take a very commanding lead over the 6600H, though it doesn't get us into the triple-digit FPS average territory. Still, having the 1% lows comfortably above 60 does mean that the overall playability of the game is significantly higher, and you can tell by the frame time charts just being so much smoother with the upgraded memory. Where before, with the single channel memory, it had a pretty noticeable gap between it and the 6600H, it now widens the gap, but at the exact opposite direction. And Tiny Tina's Wonderland ends up being one of the biggest comeback stories here, where we ended up seeing some abysmal 1% lows and an FPS average that is very close to just 30. With the upgraded memory, we now get pretty much a almost 60 FPS average with 1% lows that absolutely mog the 6600H. So especially in this title, it was very much a worthwhile upgrade that ends up improving the overall playability of the game, where it truly feels like a generational upgrade in comparison to the 6600H, almost like going from a previous generation console to a more modern one, you know, the leap from something like the PS4 to a PS5, at least in terms of frame rate. Of course, Returnal comes in to humble this system after this upgrade, because even though it does end up giving us the best result in terms of FPS average that we've seen so far, and our 1% lows do see a nice bump in performance, it's nowhere near playable. You're going to have to mess around heavily with FSR to get this anywhere near a playable state, and realistically speaking, you're not going to be able to achieve that with the 6800H. But this is a very demanding title, and this does still show that it has a pretty massive lead over the 6600H once you upgrade the memory. Black Myth Wukong was one of those titles that ended up also seeing a significant leap in terms of performance, where now instead of falling noticeably behind the 6600H, it has a commanding lead over it, where with an FPS average of 34 and a 1% low of 28, it does start to enter into the territory of potentially being a playable experience, as long as you're willing to tolerate a 30 FPS average and visuals that are less less than ideal. Still, in the single channel configuration and with the 6600H, the idea of this being a playable experience is kind of out of the question in comparison. So it does mean that there is a meaningful upgrade here. And of course, lastly, taking a look at Company of Heroes 3, you can see here that again, we ended up seeing such a massive leap in performance where while before it was very comparable to the 6600H, so at least it wasn't falling behind it, it now gets a pretty substantial bump in performance where the FPS average means we're going to get a 60 FPS average most of the time, and the 1% lows means that this is going to be a very smooth, very consistent experience. This is a pretty meaningful lift, and that is going to increase your enjoyability in this title, and more importantly, you can also see that in the frame time charts, they are significantly smoother. You are not getting the same consistent little spikes that you're seeing with the 6800H in just single channel. So overall, it's a pretty spectacular result and a very worthwhile upgrade. And there you have it. Those are the benchmarks. And as you can see, it starts to make a lot of sense why all of these are within the price categories that they're at. While there is a pretty massive difference between what the Ryzen 5 5500U is doing versus say something like the 6600H, they are all kind of relatively within the same level of performance. This is really just a standout when you have the dual channel memory, and you're way more likely to get dual channel memory at around that $250 price range, but that's not guaranteed. It really is a model to model basis kind of thing. But really what all of this comparison showed is why exactly the Firebat A6 is at the price point that it's at, because if you just use it as a stock system, it is no different than these systems down here. And it really does suffer pretty dramatically in those gaming workloads versus these systems, being very comparable to the 5700U in terms of gaming performance, though it does beat it out pretty handedly in terms of CPU performance. But you are one very easy memory upgrade away from unlocking insane levels of performance. So I really think that the Firebat A6 is a hidden gem right now in the market. At the currently available $230 price point, which you can get for even cheaper because right now AliExpress is running some coupons, but at that price point, it's very competitive against everything else around it, though again, with that single channel memory, it falls behind, but it is one very easy upgrade away from absolutely destroying everything else in this price category. It is my top recommendation if you want something that you can pretty much build off of, because all of these, they are giving you 100% of the performance that they are going to be able to be capable of doing. There is no unlocking better performance. There is no improvement later down the line. This right now, you get it, you spend pretty much the same price as this system right here, and you get the same level of performance. Okay, that's not really all that bad, especially because we're talking about same level of performance when it comes to the iGPU. When it comes to the CPU, this thing clears everything else on the table here. So for day-to-day tasks, for any kind of activity like that, this is going to beat out everything else. Why would you spend $220 on this when you can spend $10 more and get this for $230? And again, AliExpress right now has coupons going on that bring the price of this thing down to the same level as this. So why would you buy this? I really think that the Zen 2 based APUs should drop down to the sub $200 price point to really make them competitive. But ignoring these, if we take a look at just the Ryzen 5 5600H, I think that this chip right here is a great value if it was at the $200 to $210 price point. You know, if you know that you don't care about the iGPU performance and you just want a good CPU, well, these two right here, effectively same CPU. And if the iGPU doesn't matter to you, well then what do you care about this thing then? You know, you don't really care about the 6600H. All you want is a good day-to-day computer. This thing is a great value, and you can find some systems out there that have that kind of setup. But at the end of the day, the Firebat just absolutely destroys everything in its price category. Again, the reason it's so cheap is that because at its stock configuration, it is so comparable to everything else here, you know, falling behind even sometimes this specific chip. And you might be misled into thinking that the 6600H is the better option here, but again, this is giving you 100% of what it's capable of doing. This is one very simple memory upgrade away from absolutely clearing everything else that we compared today. Now, I understand that there are a lot of people out there that do not want to buy on AliExpress. Perfectly valid. I personally don't really have any issues buying anything on AliExpress. I've never run into any issues, but some people have that aversion, and I completely understand. If that's the case, yeah, look into the Ryzen 5 6600H. Yes, it's going to give you lower lower performance than this thing once this has been upgraded, but right out of the box, a system with this is going to perform noticeably better. That said though, again, you have to pay attention to what systems come with single channel memory and which ones come with dual channel memory. That's going to be a pretty major factor. But overall, the FireBat A6 is the king of this price category. Nothing touches it at all. Even if you were to upgrade this thing, you are still below that $300 price point, which means that it absolutely destroys everything. I have no doubt that if FireBat had made this a dual channel system with 16 gigabytes of RAM, they would be charging an extra $70 for this thing. And at that price point, it's just not as competitive, though it would still be relatively competitive in comparison to everything else on the market. As it is right now configured like this, it is just such a standout deal. So while there is a lot of competition within this price category where you will find such a wide variety of different chips, there really is only a handful of them that make any sense at all. If this was $200 and all you needed was a day-to-day computer, I understand. The 6600H is just way too cut down to the point where if this is available at a cheap price point, there is no reason to ever go with the 6600H. There just isn't. Even at the price point that this sells at on Amazon, where it's closer to that $300 price limit, I think it's still worth buying, especially because you can later down the line upgrade it and it will just beat out everything else within this price tier by such a large margin, it's not even really comparable. So I'm going to link a bunch of these systems down below so you can see the prices, what's available right now, because, you know, later down the line, the prices could change dramatically. This could go up $100 out of nowhere. This could suddenly drop $50. This could suddenly get to a price point where it's far more price competitive. So check those links down below. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please leave a like, please subscribe, consider becoming a channel member. I will catch you guys in the next one.